Today we have Professor Kristopher Ramsay. Chris is the William P. Boswell Professor of World Politics of Peace and War, does them both, in the Politics Department here at Princeton. And for the past year or so has been the chair of the Politics Department here. Chris is an expert in game theory and its application to environment, to conflict, and any number of other uses. And today we'll hear about bargaining and ecosystem services. So please join me in welcoming Chris.
Well, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here and to present this work with former Princeton graduate student Noam Reich, who is an assistant professor in the political science department at Yale right now. Okay, so what are we going to do here today, right? So often when a social scientist comes and presents on the environment, they're going to give you some data, they're going to maybe tell you about a case, they're going to have some natural experiment or something like that. We're not doing that today. So what I do for a living is I'm an applied game theorist. And basically in the social sciences, applied game theorists, they tell stories about how the way things work, right? And these stories are important, right? Because in many contexts, like for example, I am particularly interested in international relations, right? We have to make a lot of policy decisions without being able to experiment, right? Because either the experiments are unethical or you can't do them at scale. Maybe we want to innovate with respect to a policy, but we have no data on that policy ever being utilized somewhere else. Right, and as you may recognize, these kinds of ideas, the stories that social scientists tell about how the world works have political consequences, right? In one way, they're going to help us kind of decide what kind of policies to choose. We're also going to set our political expectations about what's going to happen if we implement those policies. Right, and you can see this today. Stephen Miller, for example, in the Trump administration, espouses a vulgar but basically undergraduate textbook version of offensive realism when he goes on TV and tells you about how the U.S. should behave in the world. Right, so it's important that we have sort of a good understanding of how particular problems work in a theoretical sense. That is, we're able to tell stories about why certain behaviors will lead to certain causes, why certain kinds of individuals or countries or decision makers in different contexts will act in a particular way if they have a set of interests, and that the outcomes are determined by how each other interact. So while I won't be doing anything about conflict specifically today, we're going to take this exercise and tell a story. Noam and I are telling a story about the idea of payment for ecosystem services and how that could work. There's an existing story out there that motivates this policy, that when policymakers are thinking about why they would want to pursue such a thing, they have an idea of what they're doing. I'm going to describe that idea. I'm going to point to what I think are some issues with that idea, right? And important elements that are being left out. And then I'm going to, in the paper, we have a model, and the model's kind of fancy, and it's got like Bellman equations, and we're looking for fixed points and stuff. But we're not going to do that today, because a good model at the end of the day comes back to a story that you can put yourself into and think about the incentives that you would be facing in these contexts, in the decisions that you would make, so that you can understand kind of sort of the implications for a particular policy decision or a context in which you make those decisions. And so with that, we're going to start thinking about a stylized world in which we treat countries as if they were kind of like people that have preferences and motivations and desires, and that they interact with each other trying to obtain outcomes. And we're going to focus on the idea of conservation for sale. So we're going to think about countries that have an interest in making some kind of payment to other countries who have resources that obviously they don't control, but they want to have a say over how they're used, right? In particular, it usually has to do with not using them, right? And so we're going to think about that problem in this context. And so I go to 12:45-ish? Sure. Okay, So this idea for, if you want to think about the power of ideas, the idea for payment for ecosystem services is one that has, the idea for it has a long-standing in environmental policy thinking that goes back to the 1960s, and an article by Ronald Coase, right? And so George Stigler originally named it the Coase theorem, but basically there was this idea that in the absence of legal liability, it was possible for two individuals, one, say, a polluting factory, and a neighbor, a victim of that pollution, could come to some kind of agreement if it were the case that the pollution from the factory were having a negative effect on the victim of pollution. So maybe the easiest story to tell, like you can think about factories and laundries, which is, there's a very famous book by Bob Cohane where he uses that example, who was one of my colleagues before. But Coase's story is also pretty straightforward. You have a rancher and a farmer. The rancher has some cows, but bad fences. And the cows get off the ranch and eat the farmer's crops, which hurt the farmer's bottom line. That's the negative externality. It doesn't really hurt the rancher at all. In the absence of legal liability, right, there's no way for the farmer to sue the rancher over this transgression of the cows. But for, say, suppose the transgression costs like $20,000 a year to the farmer, and fixing the fence costs $10,000, right? The cows stay on the ranch and don't eat your crops, so you're pretty happy about that. Your gross gain is $20,000 because you no longer have this problem, but your net gain is $10,000 because you have to make the transfer. And Coase then basically said, well, life's not fair, right? Like, who should pay is not necessarily the question, but the question is like, can you do better by coming to some agreement between those producing the externalities and those that are victims, right? And so this is the idea that kind of underlies, you could think about, a program like this one, where Norway, Germany, and the Amazon Fund were sort of interacting. Developed countries in Europe are donating money, making agreements with countries like Brazil and Indonesia to set like baseline deforestation rates. And if you can kind of stay at or under them, or you can decrease in the appropriate way, and we monitor that every year, which is sort of nice. We have technology through satellite data to actually do such a thing. If you follow this contract, we'll pay you to not do it, right? To not do the deforestation, that being one example, right? And so the idea of this underlying this project is a very much a Coasean one, right? And even sometimes it works, right? So the point of this talk is not to say the payment for ecosystem services don't work, or that Coase was like fundamentally wrong, but it's that the process is a little bit different. And when you think about the Coase problem, as I described with the cows, the rancher, and the farm, you sort of think about there being this very big gain to trade, that is signing these contracts. And you can do it like as a one-off thing. Like once I build your fence, you have the fence. And so there's no like day after day decision about what you're going to do about your cows. But when it comes to deforestation, we can see here, this is an example of data from, this is the little pointer thing. There it is. So this is data from map biomass for Brazil from the period of 1985, which I think is where the data starts, which is why it's weird down here, right, to 2024. And you see that there was an active program for payment for environmental services that really was founded in 2008, but sort of kicked off with payments in 2009 and ran through 2019. And you see that like there's less deforestation here than there was before. And once Bolsonaro was elected, you see that deforestation returns. And basically, the program goes into suspension. And there's some, in 2023, there's some kind of start of return to the program operating, right? So it's not that Coase is wrong, right? So there's this payment for ecosystem services ideas. Seems like it could work, and it could make sense, and it could actually be beneficial for managing deforestation. But as much as being sort of kind of right, the Coase approach sets expectations about what you could actually do. And so what Noam and I are concerned about is you could start to see it even in this graph, right, which I had mentioned just a few moments ago. The story of like fixing the smokestack on your factory, I pay for it once, it's done, it's over, and we kind of consume the benefit forever, right, is one sort of problem. But the deforestation problem is a decision that you have to make every day, right? So every day you have to get up and decide that you're going to follow a policy to protect the forest, right? And fundamentally, this is going to create three related complications with the Ecosian approach to non-renewable resource conservation. In particular, we're going to have something of a commitment problem. Now, why are Noam and I doing this project? Because this is something that we think about in international politics all the time, in political economy, right? Again, we can sort of just reference things that have happened in the last 12 months, right? There's no real way for other countries to get some particular country to do a thing they don't want to do, right? So in some sense, the fundamental problem of international relations is commitment. Like, how do you actually incentivize others to do the things that you would like them to do, even if it creates mutual gain? And so in the Ecosian framework, commitment is just not an issue, right? It's just like, the actual theorem, if you read your environmental economics textbook, like has part B, which says, this can be represented as a one-shot exchange between the polluter and the victim of pollution for a single transfer to solve the problem, right? And that is not the payment for ecosystem services problem in many cases, right? The second thing that's different, right, is the dynamics of it all, right? So it's very hard in most cases, like especially if we're thinking about deforestation, to chop down the whole forest at once, right? So the deforestation is happening at a rate. Now, in our theory, our model that we're going to talk about, that rate's going to be fixed. So we're going to be thinking about the extensive margin, not the intensive one. But you could write a model where there was an intensive margin, like you tried really hard to cut down lots of forests, or you don't try so hard, and the logic is basically going to be the same. But dynamics has this interesting effect, which is like, if I actually care about, say, this auditorium is the forest, right, and you can only remove a seat at a time, well, the world still looks pretty good to me if I care about the whole thing, if I just take away the first seat. And actually, when I take away the second seat, and when I take away the third seat. So there's going to be a question about, when have you taken away enough seats that I actually start to care enough to pay, right? And so that's going to be another element that's going to be relevant for payment for ecosystem services in these kinds of deforestation situations, because I get to consume all the stuff you weren't able to destroy in one period. I get to consume the value of it as a carbon sink, or as a habitat for monkeys, or frogs, or whatever it is that you care about that's driving you to make this payment, while you're kind of degrading it, until we get to a point where that next seat, that next tree is too important to me. And that's going to, again, be a different kind of story. Now, it's not deeply different, but it does set a different set of political expectations about what you think payment for ecosystem services could actually save, right? And if you want to be able to evaluate the policy ex post, you want to make sure that you have the right story in mind about what it was capable to do in the first place, right? And then the third thing, which is, I'll just mention it at the end, is part that we're kind of working on, and it's just kind of an interesting game theory feature of the model, right? Is that we have a suite of solutions that we think about in institutional design and politics that are related to stories that social scientists tell about how cooperation can work. And often they're the classic example is trade, right? Right? So when it comes to the size of the pie, how much there is for people to eat in the world, right? Your basic introductory economics class told you that specialization was good, right? There are gains from trade, and so if you specialize in one thing and I specialize in another and we trade, there's more pie for all of us to eat. And so you want to have free trade, right? Create those incentives for that to happen if you care about sort of global welfare. And then our institutions around trade are based on the idea that we can kind of turn it on and off at any time, right? So what I'd really like to do is you to open your borders to me and me keep my borders closed to you, right? And get the tariff, but also get the benefit of your cheaper goods. So how will we prevent that from happening? Well, we have a whole suite of institutions that are working less well now than they used to, but are based on the idea that, if we cooperate, then, if you open to me, I open to you. But if you close to me, then I retaliate and close to you, right? And we've seen this happening in the news recently as well, right? But for that whole mechanism to work, there has to be always the opportunity to turn the cooperation on and off. The problem with forests, for example, is there's a last tree, right? And the fact that there's a last tree makes it impossible to build those kinds of institutions. So the reciprocal cooperative institutions that sort of underlie a lot of international, like if you are interested in this, like international environmental economics and conversations about how we're going to reach agreements to, like with respect to the Paris Agreement and CO2 emission targets and all these sorts of things, right? They always kind of rest on like these what we call folk theorem kind of results or relational contracts, which are kind of like, we're going to do something cooperatively, and if you're the kind of person who cooperates, we're going to keep cooperating with you, and if you're the kind of person who doesn't, we're going to punish you, right? And that kind of thing is going to break down in this kind of environment. I won't get into that in too much detail. Again, that's kind of like an interesting game theory fact that this kind of problem won't have that ability. Okay, so hopefully at the end of the day, I understand that most people aren't game theorists. Maybe there are some of you here, but at the end of the day, what I want to do is like have a new story in mind about how payment for ecosystem services could work, what your expectations should be about them, and then questions for me about what your sort of favorite alternative construction would be, and like how we can think about that thing's consequence in the context of a very simple story about the incentives around such a thing. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we're going to see today is in some sense the lack of commitment power by countries means that these payments have to be periodic and self-enforcing. So that's good news for us because that's what happens, right? So like in this context, it's going to have to be the case. And I can't just do the Coasian thing in the first period. I'll briefly explain to you why that's the case, but like it's going to have to be this, you save enough trees, I give you a little money, you continue to save enough trees, I give you a little more money, and it's going to have to look like that, right? We're going to see this thing that I mentioned, with the reference to the use, right? So incentive created by gradual consumption of the resource create situations where delays in agreements that encourage, in some sense, deforestation, right? It's like there's going to be, even for the well-intended donor, there's just going to be times where the preferred thing to do is just sit there and wait, right? And so what we're going to do is kind of characterize the conditions under which they stop. And what is the size of the forest that they're willing to protect, and why do they choose that size and not a different size? And then I'll have like a brief discussion of what happens if there's like price volatility or something, right? And then you can ask me more questions about that. But there's going to be like the natural thing to expect, like your political expectation about how this stuff should work, should be one in which there's a bunch of deforestation, even when there's intents to protect the forest or to protect the resource. And if you asked the donor, would they be willing to pay to protect the whole thing, if it meant compensating the owner of the resource for the entire stream of consumption from that thing? The answer is yes. They're still going to have an incentive to wait, right? And hopefully we'll see why that's the case, right? We're going to see that the way that this mechanism works is basically going to tell us that steady state solutions, right? So when are we actually going to reach a point where we could have a block of a resource that's conserved? Like what is that going to look like in an equilibrium, right? And that's going to be one that's going to pit the marginal incentives of the donor. That is like how much does it cost me to move that one more increment of a smaller forest, to what you might consider the stock incentive of the recipient. Because once we reach an agreement and a particular payment at a particular time at a particular size of forest, it's kind of like an annuity, right? Like, so every year you're going to kind of pay me this little bit. I'm not going to consume the forest. But what am I comparing that annuity to? I've got a stream of that payoff and the ability to actually consume the resource, right? And so these are very different kinds of quantities, which make for, again, potentially much smaller scope for the size of things that payment for ecosystem services could save. So in that sense, if we're going back to the Coasian model, where I had my cows and the farmer was losing $20K a year to the cows eating the crops, right? The kind of like the total social value of this investment in the fence was like $20,000, right? And so they were willing to pay 10 and get the net benefit of 10. Like when this kind of marginalist model kind of story, right, you're never going to get to represent that total social value in the size of the thing that you conserve. And then this is the thing I mentioned before, which is like one slide if I get to the end, and we can talk about it a little bit more. But like these standard models for fostering international cooperation through institutional design, like we actually haven't found one yet. Right? So the last part of the project that we're still working on is trying to characterize like what's the best possible sort of incentive consistent payment for ecosystem services that you could have. And my belief right now is basically this, right? And so, but TBD, but I can explain why these don't work, which I kind of did a little bit already. Okay, so if the cozying story is not the right one, then what is? Or maybe not what is. What's my alternative story is going to be one of conservation for sale with dynamics. So how is this story going to work? So instead of farmers and ranchers, I'm going to have like a home country and a foreign entity. So, as is the case with all good stories, you have some characters, they have some quirks and motivations, they have goals, and then you put them in a context and you see when they play what happens. And so my two characters in my story are going to be a home country and a foreign country. The home country is going to have a rainforest, and it's going to start with some number of trees. Right? It could be something else, like any kind of ecological object that you want to preserve. And it's just like the world starts, and there it is. Right? We're going to start from the position that home likes the cutting trees and gets some payoff each period when it does. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean home is bad. If you read the paper, there's lots of research in political economy and development economics that tell us things like, yes, environmental degradation is bad, but clearing a lot of, say, virgin rainforest for agricultural production actually has a massive impact on the stream of wealth for that particular family, right? And also can have effects on the community, like having access to healthcare and education and other sources of revenue, right? So home is not bad. They just have to make decisions about how they use the resources they have. And if they don't want to cut down the forest, then this is a super easy problem, right? Like if no one wants to cut down the forest, then I can just go home now, eat my turkey sandwich, and like we're all done, right? So the interesting cases is when home actually weighing these trade-offs decides that they would actually like to use that land for some alternative form of development or resource extraction. On the other hand, there's nothing necessarily great about foreign, right? Maybe foreign's already rich and they've destroyed their environment in their home country. UK, they don't really have any trees, right? But it may still be the case that there's externalities associated with cutting the next tree or preserving a biome. And so they would like to keep it, right? And in particular, they have a preference for more versus less. And they're just going to have something that we call payoff function, which is just like assigns some number to the size of the forest. And it's going to have the property that number gets bigger as the forest gets bigger. But we're also going to have the property that preference is what we call concave, which means that more is better, but at a decreasing rate, right? So I'm really interested in, a forest of size, 100 hectares, but like 101, yeah, I like it better, but that 101st hectare is not as great as maybe the 51st one, right? And so as it gets bigger, I kind of start caring less and less, even though I'm happy. That I'm happier with bigger rather than smaller. Since we have a dynamic problem, people are going to have to weigh trade-offs between today and tomorrow. If you just read Chris's letter from the president, right? Like this intergenerational concerns, like how you actually spread out your preference from now till tomorrow. Here we're going to assume that we slightly favor, today over future payoffs. And maybe that's because you won't be around in the future, right? So decision makers, so one way you can interpret this delta is that as an interest rate, right? So, if the value of things or the cost of things is going to increase over time, then you'd rather sort of consume today than tomorrow with this fixed budget. Another way to interpret the discount factor delta here, which is very common, is to think of it instead as the probability of remaining in office, right? So it could be that I'm thinking about a future in which maybe I'm not the decision maker, or a future in which the environment is not as important to me. But everyone's going to have this kind of intertemporal relationship with their preferences, where they favor things closer to today and discount things that are farther away. And then, the simple payment for ecosystem services thing is just like foreign can pay home. When home gets money, they're happier than when they don't. And foreign is less happy to give more money, right? And that's basically that's the context in which we're going to think about players and motivations. This is what people care about. I'm sure you'll have questions about like alternative specifications, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. Okay, so now we've got our actors on the stage, but what is the set? Like, so how are they playing? Right, so we're going to think about a world where, I mentioned a few moments ago that, the textbook definition of the Coase theorem is basically the agreement that you get if the person who is suffering the externality of pollution made a proposal to the polluter to do the thing that would make the pollution stop, right? So it's like this one-shot bargaining thing. So we're just going to take that for the purpose of this discussion in here and repeat it, right? So we're going to be doing like the Coasean thing, but just over and over again. So there's going to be time. It's going to start today and go forever. Foreign's going to propose, it's going to start off by foreign proposing a payment in every period that can't be negative, but doesn't have to be positive. The home country, and it's going to be in exchange for choosing not to cut down a tree today. At that point, the home country gets to choose, am I going to accept this offer and conserve the forest today? Maybe not tomorrow, but today. Or am I going to reject it and cut down the forest, a particular tree in my forest, like 1 unit of resource, right? When the offer is accepted by home, it's going to decrease Ford's payoff by the amount that they have to pay and increase homes by the same amount. And then in these sort of stochastic, so this is a stochastic game, like infinite horizon stochastic game in game theory. You need a law of motion, which tells us how the state, which started at n0, which was the size of the initial resource, changes over time as a function of actions. And for us, we have a very simple one, right, with my little Lorax here. So we can imagine that when decisions are made in what we call the stage game in each period, they're going to determine how many trees are left. So, for example, if we started off in a world with 4 trees and we chose not to cut, tomorrow, day 2, we're back in the state with 4 trees. Right? If we decide to cut, then the next day we end up with 3. If we cut again, we end up with 2. If we cut again, we end up with 1. Cut again, and we got none. Right? And so it's a pretty simple game. And the nice thing is it's sort of basically a direct extension of the kind of Coasean problem with this underlying state dynamic and repeated decisions to maintain the resource with payments. So for the game theorists, if you're here, I'm going to talk about strategies to some extent, but often not in a lot of detail. But when you're thinking about what a strategy is for a player in this game, that is like, what are the things that they could do in principle? A strategy for foreign is going to be an offer in every period that can depend on lots of things, like the number of trees that are there and the past behavior of all the players. And in fact, in principle, they could be probabilistic. Like I could decide to give you some amount of money or not, or I could draw from a distribution of potential payments. Basically anything's open to me. A strategy for home is a conservation plan for every period that can depend on the offer that you're facing, the number of trees that you have left to consume, and all the past behavior. And for us, we're going to, when you do game theory things, we define what is like a stable state with respect to an equilibrium concept. Our equilibrium concept is subgame perfection, which is a refinement of Nash equilibria for dynamic games. And basically what that means is that what we're going to look for is a set of strategies such that at every history, so for every sequence of things that could happen in the game, And for every number of trees there are, right, each player is going to be playing offer strategy, so that's sigma F for foreign, and conservation plan, sigma H for home, such that given what foreign is doing, home can do no better than the thing that we describe. And given what home is doing, foreign can do no better than the thing that we describe. Right? So there's no opportunity for unilateral deviation to improve their situation. And this is the sense in which we're requiring the outcome to be self-enforcing. Right? So it's like optimization, except it's conditional on what the other person is doing. And what the other person is optimizing is conditional on what you're doing. And then we're looking for a fixed point at that thing. Okay. The subgame perfect part basically says, I can't make non-credible threats. Right? You can't base your behavior today on something you think I will do tomorrow, when you know full well when tomorrow comes, I'm not going to do it. Right? So subgame perfection rules out the kind of arguments you have with your kids where you say, if you don't do X, I'm going to take your phone away for 6 months. Everyone knows you're not going to do that because you're driving to North Carolina this weekend, and if you don't give them the phone, they're going to drive you crazy, right? And so that's not a credible threat, so your kid doesn't respond. We're going to incorporate that kind of idea. I mean, that's basically the fundamental idea of subgame perfection as a refinement of these sort of Nash equilibria. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to say is the much more the happier, Kosian one-shot framework, in principle you could do it. It's a strategy open to you in this game, right? It would look something like, I pay for the whole forest, I want to preserve the whole forest. I'm going to pay for it up front, right? On day one, give you the money, right? And if you accept, you keep the money. And then what, right? Well, for the problem of conservation of forests, tomorrow comes. Right, so now it's tomorrow, and I've got your money in the bank, and I'm sitting here looking at a forest. I'm like, hey, let's cut down the forest, right? So the one-shot Nash Kosian kind of story can happen in principle, but can't happen in practice in my story, right? So it's open to them. We haven't ruled out this sort of social, total social internalization of the benefit of conservation. But what we're saying is that if you think the world looks like that graph from Brazil's forest payment for ecosystem services program, if you believe that graph that you have to make the decision every period, then I can't do this, right? Because then why would I pay you all the money for the forest if you're just going to cut it down anyway, right? So the Kosian benchmark doesn't work, but that's okay because that's all right. We just want to know what the right benchmark is. So then the question becomes what kind of agreements can we reach? And you might imagine that even though the story is pretty simple, right, it could be very elaborate, right? It could be the case that I, as home, condition whether I'm going to cut down the forest today, not on just what you offered me today, but what you offered me yesterday, last week, 6 months ago, 10 years ago, the size of the forests, my own behavior in the past. That's all fair game, right? But it turns out in this game that doesn't happen, right? In fact, the nice thing about the dynamic payment for ecosystem services story here is that even though all this complication is possible, the actual behavior of individuals is quite simple. So let's think about kind of building our intuition for the kind of decisions people are making. So the easiest way to do this is kind of like a cheap induction. So we'll start with a world in which the initial state, or that we consider as one in which there's only one tree, right? So suppose there's one tree, and foreign really wants to keep the tree enough to be willing to pay for it. And so what's going to happen? Well, with one tree, we know that home can get at least the value of that tree, because if you don't pay me enough to not consume the tree, then I'm going to cut it down, right? But it turns out that I don't have to pay you really any more than that, right? Because if you asked me for more than that, then you're getting a strict positive benefit from this agreement. And I could cut that benefit in half, which would still be a strict positive benefit. And I could do that forever, right? And if you actually cut when I gave you just enough, I could always offer you a little bit more to make you not. So the only thing that's stable with one tree is that I make a proposal that basically compensates you for the consumption of this tree. It's going to do it in an annuity fashion, right? Which is like I'm going to pay you each period some amount such that the stream of my payoffs is equal to the value of the tree. But that's what I'm going to offer. The credibility part is going to come in for foreign, right? So it's not the case. So the question is could foreign, like you need to get at least that much. Could foreign do a little better by maybe saying, hey, how about I don't give you any money today, but I give you a lot tomorrow? It turns out they can't, right? Because suppose I did make such an agreement with you, right? And you said, okay, sure. And then tomorrow we show up and we're in the exact same situation, right? There's one tree, I'm making proposals, time goes on forever. There's nothing fundamentally different about the problem yesterday and the problem now, right? So I'm going to do the like Lucy's football. Like, well, if you were willing to accept nothing yesterday for some future payment, I'm going to push it off one more time. Like, you should accept nothing today, right? And so home in a subgame perfect equilibrium is going to understand that Lucy's going to pull the football, right? And so that kind of promise can't stand. So what we end up with is like with one tree. So an agreement in periods with one tree, right, gives home just enough to stay on the no-cutting plan, right? And basically they're trading off an infinite stream of payments like this annuity for eating the tree right now. So that's just like, so there you go. That's what the incentives are. And then it turns out, if you just back up, the problem looks the same when you have two trees, right? It's just that now with two trees, players have, so both players are going to have a unique payoff should they reach this state with one tree. So having two trees is just like the problem of having one tree for these two players. Only home needs to just get paid a little bit more in that annuity because it actually knows that if it accepts, then we'll be at the state with two trees. You make the offer again, and I'll accept it. And so you got to pay me a little bit more to give up the two trees, right? And then you can do an induction thing, which basically says, well, if this holds between one and two trees, then suppose there are n and n plus one trees. If it holds between those two, then it holds for all, right? And so why do we care about that? Well, we can think a little bit about it. Ted said a little bit about this already, but before I go to the actual characterization of what happens in equilibrium, let's think a little bit about the nature of the payments. So I said foreign is going to offer just enough to keep home indifferent, right? And what exactly that means in terms of our model was just the payment that I give you with n trees plus tomorrow, which I discount, I get some continuation value for being in the game. That's the V for the home country with n trees. And that has to be better for me than cutting down the tree today and then moving to tomorrow, discounting the future, and having to play the game with one less tree, right? And so, you can do some math magic, which we do in the paper, to kind of rearrange things and figure out exactly what has to be paid for any given number of trees to the home country to make them sign on to this conservation plan. And the conservation plan, in terms of a sanity check, has properties that we think, and I think you'll think as well, make sense, right? So as the size of the forest gets really big, right, it becomes very costly for me to get stuck in one of these little steady states where you're paying me the annuity, because look at all the trees I could cut, right? And so as the number of trees gets very big, you have to pay me a lot. And as that goes to infinity, in fact, you have to pay me in the annuity exactly as much as I would get from cutting down a tree today, right? So the price gets big as the size of the forest gets very big, which will be important in a minute, right? The other thing is like a sanity check. So when delta goes to 0, what does that mean? I do not care about tomorrow, right? Well, if I don't care about tomorrow, why do I care about annuities, right? What I care about is eating the tree today, in which case, again, I have to pay you the full value of the tree to get you to stop. And then finally, as I care as much about the future as I do today, then the annuity can get very small because I'm just summing up from now into the future a very small amount of money. And so in the limit, it's actually 0, but that's a different story. Okay, so given all that, we understand what it is that home needs from foreign in order to play the conservation program that foreign wants it to play, right? The question for foreign is when do I want to make a payment to stop deforestation? And so what we show in the paper, again, there's not a lot of math, but maybe there's one more, but I don't think so. But okay, so what we are able to show in the paper is that this is kind of a very simple problem for foreign now, even though it potentially could have been very complicated. And that's that there's some unique size of the forest, N star, such that whenever the size of the forest drops below it, we enter a steady state. And this condition here tells us exactly what that thing is. And that is like the biggest forests such that the pi here, I could explain where that comes from, but just think of it as like a number, right? So basically the question is like how much I have to value sufficiently moving from a world with n trees to n minus 1 trees and kind of consuming that forever. So this is what I said at the beginning, right? So before with the Coasian framework, we kind of had like the social value of our interaction. There was like some cost from your externality. There was some potential cost to get out of the externality and a net benefit for me, right? And so that was kind of like a big picture, how much do I care about the forest? This problem is one in which I'm asking at every increment, am I willing to pay to not face a world where I'm 1 tree shorter than I am today? So this turns this problem for foreign into a well-known problem in economic theory, which is optimal stopping, right? So because home cuts 1 tree at a time, foreign asks, when am I not willing to pay for the next tree? And this is different from what home is asking all the time, which is, am I getting enough from this deal to forego the entire remaining stock of this forest? And this is going to sort of generically, I guess I'll just say it here. So this is going to generically result in much smaller forests and very different kinds of, if you went into the data or you interviewed someone, a donor from Norway, like they're going to be thinking about very different kinds of problems in this framework than they were in the Coasian one. And like this is just a picture of the payoff to foreign to give you a sense of where this cut point comes from. So here are like 3 figures, or 1 figure with 3 functions. Right, so this red line is just like if foreign didn't do anything and just had to live in a world where home always cut, like over time, this would be the payoff in each period. The total payoff would be the sum under the curve, right? The blue line into black here is the payoff that the country would get if they locked in the steady state at each one of the values. And then the black line is the equilibrium line, where for some amount of time, right, between 10 trees and 6, I just let home consume because the forest is pretty big. And these individual losses are not that high, but then I hit a point where I'd rather not move down to the next smallest forest and consume it forever. And that gives you your N star picture. So in this optimal stopping framework, so generically, the marginal value of a change is not the value of conserving the resource in question. So the story that we have to tell ourselves about what a successful payment for equilibrium, ecological system services would look like is one in which we're not asking the second question, but we're asking the first, right? And in some sense, that's the best we could hope for, given a set of players who have the preferences that we've described, which are pretty natural. And in general, the optimal stopping decision will delay agreement and allow deforestation. So even once you set something up or you declare your interest in doing such a thing, deforestation is going to happen. And then, so I guess I'm coming reasonably close to the end of my time. Maybe I've gone over a little. Other things that we do in the paper, the point of this talk was trying to give you this story to how to think about evaluating payment for ecosystem services so that you can decide whether you think it's a good idea to do them or you'd like to do something else, or alternatively, what the right expectation is for their outcomes. We think about other sorts of problems. One that I think is particularly interesting is a story where in every period there's a value shock, right? So sometimes the forest is worth a lot and sometimes the forest is worth a little, and there's some probability that it takes on each of these 2 values. When that happens, things get slightly worse sometimes, right? So there are going to be 3 cases. In particular, where there's going to be when the low value state payoff is so low that home doesn't want to cut, right? They'd rather wait for the value to go up. So you could imagine that, if this were trying to clear a forest to get at cobalt, right? So the value of that stuff is different at different points in time. When it's low, it's not worth cutting, right? But when it's high, it is. And so one version of having dynamic values in this model is that if it's the case that the low value is actually pretty low, then it's actually no different. It's just that home is not going to cut in low value periods. When it comes to high value periods, Bourne is going to be asking itself the same optimal stopping question: do I want to stop the cutting today, or do I want to wait for some future date? And everything kind of goes through as planned, except there'll just be periods where home cuts or does not cut without payments. The second is that the low value of pi is high enough that home will consume in both cases. And what happens here is that Form will start by paying to prevent to cut in a low value state, but is not willing to do so in the high. So you'll see like oscillation in the program, right? And so what it's basically doing is slowing down the rate at which we've reached the steady state, which would be good, say, for, I guess if you're thinking about long-term trajectories of carbon or something, right? You basically will slow down deforestation, but at the end of the day, the same story as before happens, right? In the low value state, if the high value state's too high, then if foreign's not willing to pay, then you end up with no forest at the end of the day. But then if that's not the case, then if the high value that of pi is low enough, then you're back to my original story, right? Which is there's an optimal stopping. But eventually the forest will get small enough that foreign is willing to pay payments to home in both states. But it'll be smaller than in the previous case. All right, so I think I'm basically out of time, so I'll just say this one last thing, right? So the one thing I'll just point out is like the fun game theory fact for those who might be one. So the fact that, that induction argument we did from 1 tree to 2 tree to 3 tree to 4 tree, right, basically pinned down unique payoffs in equilibrium in every subgame perfect equilibrium of this game. And so that means that we can't do the normal folk theorem thing, which is, do something, you do something good and we continue to do it. Right? You do something bad, like you cheat on me and it's good for you for one period, but I can revert to some alternative payoff to punish you for that behavior. That can't happen in this kind of game, even though it's infinite horizon. And so since the end of World War II, international cooperation has been fostered by, in many domains based on reciprocity. In general, this requires that the benefit of cooperation be turned on and off. But here, there's a state with one tree, and when that final tree is cut, there's nothing left to do, so this condition fails. And reciprocal rewards and punishments are not possible, so that kind of institutional design doesn't work. All right, so in the end, right, so what we're trying to convince you of is that you should have a different story in mind when you think about payment for ecosystem services, and it's not exactly a Coasian one. That the lack of commitment and the dynamic considerations force periodic self-enforcing payments, dynamic consumption favors delay, and conservation becomes an optimal stopping problem, leading to sort of systematic deforestation in these programs, and that we don't, as of right now, know how to do better with payments. It doesn't mean you can't do other things, but if you think that you can find a solution to deforestation through payments, even in the best possible world, it's limited. And that's all I got. Thank you very much.
And so we have a couple mics out there, and I see some questions here, and I've noted that. Is there a student or early career? Yep, that hand over there, second row from the back there. And then I've got it.
Thank you. Over here.
Hey.
If this were the only game being played in the real world, in terms of deforestation, would the world have more or less forests than it does today? And are we at a steady state under this framework?
So it's, if this were the only game being played, then, so I guess it depends on what you mean by the only game being played, right? So if like at the beginning of time, this was the problem, for conservation, right? and no one had to invent or think about what the policy would be, then the existing, the existing payment for ecosystem services in principle would be the ones that were being willing to be paid. Now, the fact that they're fluctuating, like in the real world, they're fluctuating in and out, means that the best case for this situation is like the stochastic one. But I guess what I would say in terms of like what the purpose of this particular paper or this particular exercise is trying to think through a world in which you can make choices about different kinds of policy, right? So I'm not making a claim that this is the only kind of policy you can choose. I'm not making a claim that these are the only things that matter even if you choose this policy. The claim that I want to make is that when we sit in rooms and make policy decisions, we tell ourselves stories about what we think those policies are going to do. And then how we frame those stories to our constituents and our allies and other people, right, to some extent we determine our success and failure in that process. And so the important thing that I think we're trying to do here is try to figure out, like, what's the right, like, if we want to understand what this process could look like, what is the right way to understand it? And then, like, make intelligent decisions about whether you'd want to choose this or something else. Like, my foreign doesn't have the option of doing something else. Like, something else could be promoting development so that there's things to do other than cut down the forest, right? The policy could be punishing people who cut down forests in other ways, like not making payments, but excluding them from trade regimes, invading them, right? Like, I think I once had a version of a paper similar to this one, which is called Occupy the Amazon, right? And the question that we were thinking about was, so what happened, like, is there a threshold at which the importance of environmental resources becomes so high that they become a cause of war, right? But, like, I'm not prescribing war, but, like, these are things that are possible. And you just kind of, I think what we're trying to do is think sort of rigorously about what such a program would look like in a world with these incentivized actors. And then, like, would we choose it? Yeah.
So we have Simon and then Lars. And then
Well, maybe I can just talk loud enough.
we're recording for the people on the internet. So
Thanks very much. Great talk. It seems quite likely that that the home country, if it's Brazil here, will have a higher discount rate than the foreign country. Does that change anything qualitatively in your calculation, or is it just a numerical modification?
So if you think about what the problem is, right? It's like I have to decide. So it's going to change the threshold.
Yeah.
But so quantitatively it would change, but not qualitatively. Like, so basically, if the home country's discount rate is smaller than foreign's, then they have to pay them more in that annuity that I'm describing, right? Now, whether depending on how, like, if you just hold foreign's fixed and decrease homes, that makes it more costly to get them to give up sort of consumption today for the stream tomorrow. And if you've held my discount rate constant, then that means I'm going to wait for a smaller forest to do it, right? So like one of the political, like, so if you thought about political institutions affecting this kind of model. So the nice thing about a simple model like this one is you can kind of like tunnel in different mechanisms, right? So imagine that I'm thinking about an institution where leaders are turning over all the time. That's a story of low discount rates, right? Which means that, we saw in the straight up comparative static, it means I need to first order, I just need to get more today, right? Because I don't value the future very much because I'm going to be out of office or in jail or somewhere else, right? But it also has a second order effect, which is it changes the threshold for which the foreign country is willing to pay, and both in a bad way. So you'd hope that, like, for example, in a democracy that, like, the underlying preference is driven by the citizenry and not the preferences of an individual leader who may turn over and over. But you can see how those different institutional characteristics might affect such a such a program.
And also might be because they simply need the income from the resource.
Yeah,
On the mic.
if pie's really big, right? Yeah.
Then Lars, and then first Lars, and then over there. Yeah.
Hey, thank you. Very nice talk. I'm wondering if you thought about, your model has to do with incentives based on perceived value or cost and their interaction. But there are two potential asymmetries that I'm wondering if you've considered. One is if you scale the system up. It's not foreign, and what did you call it? Consumer and home. What was it, foreign and home? Yeah, it's actually a coalition of the willing foreigners that have a perceived cost, which also may actually affect home. So that means there's actually a game at the higher level, and you get dynamics at the higher level. And also as you go down the scale, I mean, this is a nation's, this is a certain scale. It's a very scalar-dependent analysis. If you go down, the question is if there are asymmetries in the incentives of how pie is distributed. As you go into the person that actually holds the chainsaw, right, and the marginal cost benefits contingent on the behavior, either I cut this tree or my alternative is what. That doesn't necessarily scale up to your analysis. So there are two asymmetries. One is going up and one is going down. And I'm wondering whether you've thought that through and how dependent you are on those.
Yeah. So the story is dependent, right? Going up, we have thought a little bit about that problem. And our natural inclination is to think about, well, what if there are groups of donors? In which case, our initial cut was like, free riding, right? So now it's worse from the foreign side because not only do I not want, here at least I'm fully responsible, right? So I can pay, and I have to pay for it to stop. But if there's a group of us who could pay, then I'd much rather for you to pay for it to stop than me, which makes the decision have two parts, right? There's this threshold, which is how I behave if I were by myself. And then there's the contribution game, how much would I give? And then I'm hoping that you'll give too. And so you get a different set of contributions, which then is not sufficient for home for such a large forest. Because remember, larger forests are hard to preserve because look at all the trees I could cut, right? I mean, not really trees, but you understand what I'm saying? Look at all the resources I'm leaving on the table. When it's big, that's a lot, right? And so as the group dynamics at the contributor level, if they have the free riding problem, then it's going to do worse. As you go down, one thing that we did think about. I think again, it's we recognize going down as an issue, right? Even in the Brazilian case, the most successful program was one that was about enforcement, right? Because it's hard. The central government's problem was actually preventing people on the ground from cutting the forest down or burning the forest for agricultural purposes, sometimes just for subsistence farming, right? But going down is the way we thought about it is what if instead of promising to keep the forest intact, you promised to exert effort to do such a thing, but you couldn't completely control it. Again, our model's wrong, right? But it does give you a framework for thinking about that, which is, what does that mean? Well, it means that the value of trying to hit the steady state today is less. Because there's some chance we end up with one less tree tomorrow, regardless of our joint efforts at the international level to make this happen. So again, bad. So in some sense, this is the best case scenario for it. But I get this question a lot as an IR person because I always talk about countries as if they were people, and they're they're not people. They're not, right? To which my response is always well, even if you could fix all the other problems, this one is still going to be there, right? And so it's, in some sense, in my mind, the right benchmark for international questions in which, other colleagues of mine who are interested in other aspects of political economy should layer on as we kind of move from kind of this abstract theoretical constructs to the real world. But that's, yeah. Sorry.
So we have a question here, and then, unfortunately, I think we're looking at the time. Yeah.
Thanks. I was just curious about how the renewal of resources, like either over like a longer time frame, like naturally, or more intentionally through like reforestation, affects either the decision maker's behavior.
This is a very good question. So we've been discussing doing a second paper where trees grow back. So some kinds of resources, I think this is a very natural model, where the regrowth is not the same object, right? Or something like strip mining a nature preserve. Like that's this kind of question. I think that would be interesting things that happen when trees grow back, but I'm not exactly sure what they are. Like what you would imagine is like a home could cut a bunch and then stop and let the trees grow back and then cut again, which might actually give them the ability to like punish foreign in this framework. But it's trickier than any of the other questions I've gotten into what actually happens, but it'd be very interesting. But for the context in which the resource is something that doesn't come back like it can come back way in the future, right? Because some number between 0 and 1 raised to the power 50 is really small, right? And so like if you're thinking things happening 50 time periods from today, then it's basically irrelevant to this question. But if they could happen quickly, then that's an interesting thing that I don't know enough about.
Okay. Well, so I apologize that I didn't get the questions, but Chris will be here. And for those of you here and listening online, I want to put 3 events on your calendar that are occurring over the next month or so. On Monday, February 23rd at 5 p.m., the Next Forever is having a climate storytelling workshop of work. These are theater works in progress exploring climate change and its impacts by playwright fellows Kate Douglas and Kate Tarker. Then on Tuesday, March the 3rd at noon 14, we're having our next faculty seminar, Professor Andrea Graham from EEB. The talk title will be Where the Wild Things Are, Mammalian Immune Response Under Environmental Variation. And then on Wednesday, March the 17th at 4:30 p.m., we're going to have our second Taplin lecture in Brigger Hall. Professor Catherine Hayhoe, who is also the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy, is going to give us a discussion of on what was it? It was hope in a warming world, and so that will be I think a very exciting discussion. So once again, let's thank Chris for a great presentation.